Welcome to Legal Spirits, the podcast of the Matone Center for Law and Religion at St. John's University. I'm your host, Mark Movsesian. In this episode, we're diving into one of the most surprising developments in international relations this year, a draft deal that purports to end the decades-long conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, brokered in August at the White House by the Trump administration. The deal signals a major realignment in the South Caucasus. It reflects a blend of hard geopolitics and faith-based advocacy, and it stirred reactions across the board. Some say it's a bold foreign policy success. Others call it a validation of ethnic cleansing and a betrayal of Christians. In this episode, we unpack the terms of the deal, what it means for regional stability, and how some Christian groups in the U.S. played a role in pushing the deal forward. To help sort through it all, I'll be joined by Dan Harre, Deputy Director of Save Armenia, a U.S.-based nonprofit that defends Armenia's sovereignty and Christian heritage. Save Armenia is part of a broader movement to protect Mideast Christians, and it calls itself a Judeo-Christian alliance. We'll talk about what all that means and how the group navigates Washington's tricky political terrain. And we'll discuss why Save Armenia supports the draft Armenia-Azerbaijan deal. In this episode, Religion and Realism, the new U.S. role in Armenia. Please stay tuned. Dan, welcome to Legal Spirits.
Thank you, Mark. It's so good to be with you. Thanks for having me.
So Dan, let's start with Save Armenia itself. What is the mission of the organization and how did you get involved with it?
Absolutely. Save Armenia exists to rally American Christian support for Armenia, the oldest Christian country in the world, and our Armenian Christian brothers and sisters. As you mentioned, I serve as Deputy Director at Save Armenia, and the organization was founded about 3 years ago in response to, at the time, what was the blockade and ethnic cleansing of an ancient community of Armenians, that region known as Artsakh or Nagorno Karabakh. So our organization was launched to raise awareness about what was happening there, but also to raise awareness among American Christians of the broader persecution that Armenians face from their neighbors in the region.
Yeah, so Dan, for some of our listeners who don't know all the ins and outs, could you give just a quick précis of the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan? Because what you mentioned sort of came at the tail end of a decades-long conflict.
Absolutely. So back during the days of the Soviet Union, there was an Armenian Soviet Republic and an Azerbaijani Soviet Republic. At that time, in order to control both of these populations more easily, Joseph Stalin took this ancient Armenian region known as Artsakh or Nagorno Karabakh, plucked it out of Armenia, and put it in Azerbaijan as sort of this semi-autonomous republic. The thinking here was by creating strife between Armenians and Azeris, it would make them easier to rule and govern. When the USSR dissolved, Artsakh declared its independence as a sovereign republic, and at the time was even considering or hoping to join Armenia proper to merge with its ethnic and religious brothers and sisters. The Azeris did not care for this, and so thus began a decades-long conflict between Armenia and Artsakh on one side and Azerbaijan on the other side about the fate of Artsakh. In the 90s, it was the Armenians that actually prevailed initially. And so for several decades, until really 2020, the Artsakh Armenians had their own sovereignty, their own free will, and were hoping again to eventually merge with Armenia proper. In 2020, Azerbaijan started conducting military operations against Artsakh, and eventually this launched into what we call the 44-day war, where they seized much of Artsakh. Armenia came to Artsakh's defense, but unfortunately for Armenia and Artsakh, they suffered devastating losses. I believe they lost 5,000 soldiers, which for us doesn't sound like much, but when you account for the fact that at the time Armenia's population was about 2.7 million, Uh, those are huge casualties for a 44-day war. In 2022, they followed up this offensive with a blockade of the region that had not yet been conquered. They starved the local population, and then after 10 months of blockade and starvation, conducted another lightning offensive and drove the Armenians out. So this is now the first time in several thousand years, actually predating even the arrival of Christianity to Armenia, that Armenians are not living in the mountains of Artsakh.
Yeah, so Dan, it's interesting. I want to talk a little bit about the religious dimensions of the conflict because I think, speaking for myself, I like your comment on this. It's possible to fall into one of two mistakes. One mistake is to say this is in essence, at bottom, a religious conflict
Mm.
between Christians and Muslims. I don't think that's fair to say.
Mm.
On the other hand, it doesn't seem to me that religion is totally irrelevant to this conflict either. And so I wonder what your comments on that would be.
Yeah. To be Armenian is to be Christian, is the opinion of most of the Armenians that I have met in the Armenian Republic. And so there, it is both, as you said, ethnic and religious. It's not one or the other. Some people will fall into the camp of, look, Azeri aggression is effectively the product of ethnic hatred, or maybe even more innocently, just cold geopolitical calculation. Others will say it was simply, this religious hatred. It's both and. After the ethnic cleansing, we did see the Azeris, and they continue to destroy the Armenian churches and inscriptions and cemeteries that are now under their control. We have pictures of them desecrating priests' bodies, that kind of thing.
And building mosques too, I think.
And building mosques, absolutely. But at the same time, it wasn't just a religious calculation. They want this land for geopolitical reasons as well. So it's
Yeah.
yeah.
I agree with that too. I mean, I think this is, as I say, you can't be too simplistic about this. It's
Mm-hmm.
it's not a religious conflict. I mean, Armenia gets along pretty well with its Muslim neighbor to the south, Iran, but
Mm-hmm.
it's also, given what we see, as you say, the desecration of churches and so on. It's not, religion is not entirely extraneous to this conflict either. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so let's talk about the agreement that was signed in August. I don't know if signed is the right word. It was initialed and not signed. It's a little bit of that is a little bit murky too. It's still a draft, but the terms are dramatic. So in the agreement, Armenia formally relinquishes any claim to Karabakh or Artsakh, as you said, grants the United States a 99-year lease to operate a new route. Even when I say that, I'm not sure, because I saw this morning that the Armenian foreign minister was saying, well, it's not really a lease. It's sort of, something else again. So I don't know. Again, the details are a little bit hazy, but there's going to be a transport route through Armenia, which is going to be built and operated by American companies that will link Azerbaijan with its exclave of Nakhchivan.
Mm-hmm.
And President Trump characteristically has called this the Trump route for international peace and prosperity, or TRIP. And in return, Azerbaijan is pledging reciprocal road access to Armenians. And Azerbaijan has also backed away from its demand for an extraterritorial corridor, which would have completely compromised Armenians' sovereignty. Now, notably, this deal does not address what you just mentioned, the 2023 ethnic cleansing of Artsakh's Armenians. It doesn't address the Armenian prisoners who are still held in Baku. And so there's been a kind of varied reaction to this. Some groups call this a national humiliation. Other groups say this buys Armenia time. And I should say Christian groups themselves have been divided about this. So from your point of view at Save Armenia, how do you evaluate this deal?
Yeah, thank you for that thoughtful question. We see it as a very, very important first step. As you mentioned, the deal itself has actually only been initialed by the foreign ministers of each respective country and not signed. So this is a very important first step towards
Right.
peace.
And so, Dan, let me just stop you a second. So,
Yes.
what does it mean to say it's been initialed but not signed? What is the significance of that?
Yes, thank you for that. So effectively, it expresses the intent of both sides to agree to the terms and to sign in the future, but without the signature, it's not legally binding. So at this point, it's more of a declaration of will.
Yeah.
Um,
Sort of, we'd call it in contracts, I guess, a letter of intent. The parties are signaling their intent to finalize this in the future.
that's right, exactly. So at this point, it's not legally binding for either of them, either domestically or under international law. Um, But as you mentioned, really the crux of this agreement is this Trump route for international peace and prosperity. This was a pretty savvy solution by the Trump administration. For the last year or two, we've actually been expecting an attack on Armenia from Azerbaijan, specifically to seize southern Armenia and create this land corridor to connect Azerbaijan proper with um, this other territory they have called Nakhichevan, which is separated from Azerbaijan proper. So they wanted to connect to Nakhichevan. Nakhichevan also is connected to Turkey, and in doing so, if you see southern Armenia, you create this sort of Turkic corridor that would stretch from Istanbul out to Central Asia. The United States, to its credit, the Trump administration, to its credit, stepped up and said, we are not going to tolerate any such attack, and set out to get creative about creating a route through southern Armenia to facilitate movement between Azerbaijan proper and Nakhichevan, but also in creating this proposed route, hopefully is going to put in a hugely important piece of what's referred to as the middle corridor. This is a proposed economic route that bypasses both Russia and Iran and would give the West access to Central Asia. So, if the Trump administration is able to pull this corridor off, and the middle corridor becomes the primary alternative to shipping through Iran and Russia, every party involved, be it the United States, Azerbaijan, Turkey, Armenia, is going to get an enormous amount of money from this. And so I think the way the Trump administration approached this was, let's sweeten the deal for everybody to get this done. Now, again, it's not across the finish line. Uh, Money and infrastructure needs to start getting poured into Armenia to make this a reality. But I think once we see those things happening, the incentives are going to be in place for the United States to push Azerbaijan to sign, and also for Azerbaijan to move forward in their own interest to get the funds that will come through this.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to that in just a little bit, but I think that's an interesting way to put it. And that's why I thought of calling this episode Religion and Realism, that
Mm-hmm.
part of this has to do with Christian advocacy. I'm going to get to that. But part of it is just, nuts and bolts realism. This is in the United States' interest to have a foothold there. And it doesn't require any military. At least at the moment, there's no one even talking about the possibility of United States military being there. Okay,
Correct.
Dan, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. But let me step back a little bit. You now mentioned the realism angle. And now let's talk a little bit about the religion angle, because Save Armenia, your organization, is part of a larger Christian advocacy network. These are groups that are working to protect at-risk Christian communities across the world, and especially in the Mideast. So could you describe a little more about Save Armenia's place in this network?
Sure. There's a number of organizations, mostly based out of DC, that do work on behalf of the persecuted church. Specifically, advocacy. There's sort of a couple different types of organizations. You have the advocacy orgs, and then the ones that do more the humanitarian work that would look more specifically like um, micro loans or micro grants, providing housing like that. But the circles we primarily run in and the work we do is more about advocating for persecuted Christians among civil society leaders and among United States government officials. Other organizations that do this kind of work include In Defense of Christians. They include International Christian Concern. There's a whole number of Armenian organizations, the two most prominent being the Armenian Assembly and the Armenian National Committee of America. And so we do fit in this sort of larger niche of organizations in DC that approach advocacy in this way.
And now, Dan, some of these groups actually have been very, very critical about this agreement, and I'm wondering sort of how Save Armenia now interacts with its allies who have a very different understanding of this.
Yeah, absolutely. Save Armenia is unique in that our coalition is actually primarily American conservative Christians, and we work on behalf of our Armenian Christian brothers and sisters, and we absolutely hear them that they are concerned about the deal, and they frankly have more to lose than we do as Americans. We hear and we actually agree with them that we're concerned that this deal does not broach the subject of the 23 Armenian prisoners in Azerbaijan. It doesn't. It doesn't discuss the right of return of the Artsaksis to their homeland. So these are concerning, but we also are political realists. We realize that we're not going to get everything we want right away, and that this deal is again an important step in the right direction. And I think our Armenian partners realize this. There's a lot of goodwill and understanding between the two sides, and I think they know that we're for them.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's probably difficult for a few reasons to be an advocate for Mideast Christians in the United States. And I wondered about your view about this more generally, not just the Armenian situation. But, I've written about this, and I've written a couple of times that, Mideast Christians are too Mideast for the right and too Christian for the left. And so they really kind of fall between the stools. This looks like a victory for Christian advocacy groups, at least according to Save Armenia. So do you think this is signaling a kind of a shift in how Mideast Christians are being perceived, or is this just kind of a one-off?
I do think it's indicative of something larger, because what we found is that when we would educate Americans about what was happening, they were almost every single time on our side, and they cared about the issue. The uphill battle, the uphill climb, was primarily one of education. So, with civil society leaders and government leaders, as soon as they knew, they cared. But another hurdle we had to get over is that if you're going to convince realists, not just conservative Christians in the US, but realists, you also have to approach the issue in a way that explains very clearly what's in it for the United States. So I don't see so much of an uphill climb in getting the religious right in the United States to care. That's just an education battle. But when it comes down to the realists, I think one of the lessons of what Save Armenia has been able to do is you've got to find a way to couch your project and the population you're advocating for, to couch it within the context of MAGA or America First, if you're dealing with a Republican administration.
Yeah, I'll talk about that just in a second, but I also wondered, as you were talking, I remembered, sometimes it's even difficult to get Christians to advocate for Christians as such. And you will sometimes hear the argument, well, this is sort of special pleading, and Christians aren't just supposed to care about Christians. We're supposed to care about everybody. Have you come across that in your work at all?
Thankfully I haven't. I think it's because people have recognized that the threat to Armenia was very, very real. We had, with the reporting, unfortunately, not as much reporting as there ought to have been, but the reporting on the blockade and the ethnic cleansing, and then statements coming from Azerbaijan broadcasting their intent to attack Armenia. I think it became pretty clear that this threat was sort of imminent. But you're right, there is sort of this broader malaise that hangs over the American church about our persecuted brothers and sisters that we just have to break through because they need us.
Yeah. And I would think, by the way, I want to bring this up too, that your work specifically at Save Armenia might be complicated because you're calling yourself a Judeo-Christian alliance. I mentioned this in the introduction, and that's got to be complicated by the fact that Azerbaijan has a very close military and surveillance alliance with Israel.
Yes.
It seems to me that's going to create obvious challenges for you. And so, how do you negotiate those challenges?
Yes. In some ways, we know that we're doing the Lord's work because we're making everybody angry. When you advocate for Armenians and the Jewish people who do not like each other particularly, you're on some interesting ground. But yeah, like you mentioned, there's a lot of tension between those two sides. Israel sells
Yeah, I
Azerbaijan.
want to push back just a little. I don't think, as a
Please.
matter of personal, I don't think it's that these two groups don't like each other particularly. It's just that, I mean, candidly, in the last 10 or so years, Israel has been Azerbaijan's great ally, supplying a lot
Right.
of assistance to it. So I just want to push back a little bit. I don't think it's a kind of a personal thing, But
And
I
there's
do want to know how you negotiate this obvious geopolitical complication.
Yes, no, absolutely. So, as you mentioned, Azerbaijan and Israel are very close, and Azerbaijan purchases about 80% of its weaponry from Israel, including high-tech drones. These drones,
80%. That's really high. 80%. Wow.
yes, extremely. And then Azerbaijan sells Israel quite a lot of oil. So it's a very real politique consideration. Most of these drones are ultimately used against Armenians in the 44-day war. Pretty much everybody in Armenia lost somebody to an Israeli drone. So yeah, there's a lot of friction there, and understandably, additionally, until until yesterday, the government of Israel had not recognized the Armenian genocide. Just yesterday, though, Patrick Bet David, who's half Armenian, half Assyrian, kind of pinned Bibi Netanyahu down, and, and Netanyahu publicly recognized it. It still needs to be formally or legally recognized by the Israeli
Yeah,
council.
so listeners should understand that we're recording this at the end of August, and it is true. Just yesterday, this happened, and I
Yes,
wasn't going to bring it up because I'm not even sure what it really means. I think it was sort of a personal recognition, right? But even that is
correct,
a change, I guess.
correct. No, that's right. And then so there's a lot of reasons for Armenians to be frustrated with Israelis. At the same time, um, Israelis, or I guess frustrated is the word, it's not the perfect word, but with Armenians, because Armenia has a fairly good relationship with Iran, not a military one, but an economic one. And this is because most of Armenia's borders are blockaded. If they lose the southern border with Iran, it's basically economic suicide. So both of these countries are in unsavory alliances in order to, I guess, survive in a region where they're surrounded by enemies. And so Save Armenia exists to be a bridge builder between these two communities, but it's not hard. The Israelis get frustrated that we that we work with the Armenians. The Armenians are frustrated we work with the Israelis. And to your point, Mark, it's not really at an individual level. It's not fair to say any one population despises the other population. It's more so between the two governments. Or you could say that the populations have a problem with each other's governments. But some
Right.
of our board members and actually staunchest advocates are Israelis, and that's in part why we're a Judeo-Christian alliance.
Yeah, I see. No, I think it's a difficult thing. I mean, Armenia also has very long historical ties with Iran too. So,
Right.
anyway, I think it's a complication. I just wanted to bring that up. So let's talk a little bit about history now, Dan. So,
Mhm.
um, because this new Trump road might really be something very, very new when you look at the sweep of history. Historically, the US role in Armenia has been very limited. In fact, a century ago, at the time of the Armenian genocide of 1915 to 1920, the US declined a League of Nations mandate to protect Armenia. It was offered to the United States. President Wilson supported it. The US Senate said no because basically this is just too far away. We're not going to commit. Well, to get to your point about realpolitik, it's too far away. We're not going to commit our resources to defending this very remote nation. And that decision helped to pave the way for the eventual Soviet takeover and domination of Armenia.
Mhm.
Now Washington is stepping in. This is definitely a new move. There are no troops involved. This is going to be just a long time infrastructure deal. But I wonder if is this a turning point in US Armenia relations?
It absolutely is. And it's the byproduct of a process that began in 2018. At risk of oversimplifying the history here, in 2018, Armenia staged a peaceful revolution to basically throw out the pro Russian, pro Soviet government in favor of a more Western leaning one. Since that time, they've worked hard to build closer ties with the United States and Europe. And I believe just last year, actually, in the waning days of the Biden administration, Armenia inked a strategic partnership agreement with the United States. So the agreement with the Trump administration is sort of a continuation of that process that began in 2018. Armenia is not yet in a position to cut ties completely with Russia. It has to move incrementally. It's still dependent on Russia for energy and things like that, but the United States is helping them to wean off of that dependence. The U.S. is going to help them build some new nuclear reactors and help them continue to move out of that Russian orbit. So I think it's a trend that we're going to see continue into the future.
Yeah, I mean, I just say from looking at it from the perspective of realpolitik from the Armenian point of view, I mean, Armenia simply can't get completely out of the Russian orbit. That's just never going
Mhm.
to happen given geography and realpolitik. But I
Right.
guess the idea is that Armenia is maybe trying to diversify things by moving a bit towards the west. There's also a lot of private U.S. investment, right? I think there's this $500 million AI center that's being talked about, which is going to be a big deal.
Yes.
And so what I hear people say who are sort of sympathetic to this, but not, they're not Nikol Pashinyan. He's the prime minister of Armenia. They're not huge Nikol supporters or something, and they're realists themselves. What they say is that the striking thing about this moment is that it may buy Armenia some time. Because with this US involvement, not military involvement, it's going to be a commercial thing, but with this US involvement, the threat of Azeri aggression against Armenia becomes a lot less, at least for the next 2, 3 years, we can hope. And that will give Armenia some time to diversify further. Uh, on the other hand, there are people who say, well, look at Aliyev right after this agreement was signed. Aliyev is the president of Azerbaijan. Right after this agreement was signed, said, okay, now Armenia has to amend its constitution before we sign anything, which is not mentioned in this draft agreement at the White House from August. So, what do you think about all this? I mean, is this really buying Armenia time? Is this the hopeful thing? I guess I'd like your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, people are right to not trust Aliyev. The man is not going to sign anything in good faith, but he will sign things because he is afraid of Trump. Um, that's very, very widely understood and evident. He is afraid to cross the Trump administration. So, as Americans and American Christians, if we're messaging directly to Aliyev, you have to sign this agreement and abide by the terms. Frankly, he doesn't care. But to the extent that the Trump administration and the United States government makes it clear to him that he is expected to abide by those terms, he will. So we have at least at this point about 3.5 years where we know we're not going to see an attack. He is petrified to cross Trump. We want this, though, to be evergreen. We want this agreement to be taken up by the next administration. We want it to be American policy, and we need Azerbaijan to understand that if you cross these lines, the United States is going to take it personally. So you are not to do that.
Right, and it does seem like it's getting institutionalized because you mentioned this
Mm.
began in 2018. But so Dan, you said that, and I've heard that from other commentators I respect too, which is that Aliyev is really apprehensive about crossing the Trump administration. But why exactly? What do you know? What is the implicit threat here from the Trump administration?
Whether the administration has made this threat to him or not, I don't know. I assume they have, but almost the entire Azeri economy is propped up by exports to Europe, exports of oil and gas. If the United States were to sanction those exports, Azerbaijan's economy would effectively crumble overnight. And we can remember when the admin did something similar back in Trump term one, when it threatened to put tariffs on Turkish aluminum and steel to get Pastor Andrew Brunson released. Well, Trump made that threat, and Pastor Brunson was released very shortly after. So we have enormous leverage over the Azeri economy, and they know that.
Right, it's interesting. You bring up the Pastor Brunson, who was the evangelical American, the Christian pastor who was in Turkey at the time. I remember that incident actually. So, how might that affect what's going on now with the Christian prisoners in Baku? And I noticed, by the way, that when President Trump mentioned this, he didn't say the Armenian prisoners in Baku. He said the 23 Christian prisoners in Baku, which again is how we sort of tie in religion and realism here. But do you think there might be a similar negotiation going on now about these hostages in Baku?
It's a good question. I don't know where the negotiations stand on that beyond, like you mentioned, we do have uh, some footage from a hot mic moment where Prime Minister Pashinyan and President Trump were discussing these prisoners. And I think Trump said something like, oh, I'll talk to Aliyev, get him released, get these guys released. He'll do that for me. Um, I think because it's not part of the agreement that was initialed, it's going to be on civil society in the United States to keep reminding the administration that they have committed to doing this. When Trump has gone on record on something and you remind his team of that, they're not going to be offended by that. He said it, and he affirms his own policies. He stands behind that. So when Ukraine and Russia and trade wars and all these things are grappling for the admin's attention, we need to remind them what they've said and that they need to put muscle behind it.
Okay, well, Dan, I think we'll have to leave it there for now. This has really been very interesting. Thank you so much for joining us. Your work at Save Armenia is part of this larger story about foreign policy realism and faith-based advocacy, and we're going to continue to follow that. Maybe we'll bring you back on if we have some more hopeful developments in the future.
Thank you, Mark. No, it was my pleasure. I'm happy to come back, and any students that you have that want to learn more about the topic or learn more about advocacy, it's my pleasure to chat with them.
Thank you very much. Thanks for that, Dan. And thank you also to our listeners. You can find my recent essay on this agreement at the First Things website, and you can learn more about Save Armenia by asking Dan, he's just offered, or by checking out their website, which is savearmenia.org. For other episodes of the Legal Spirits podcast, please visit lawandreligionforum.org or find us wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks, and see you next time.